always had a little fetish for rockabilly and rock and roll. That was like a soundtrack to daily life. Every Saturday morning was a ritual of going into the record stores, trying to discover new music. I meet this kid, and he was a music obsessive too, so he said, hey, I'm trying to put a band together. We need a guitar player. Are you interested? We were just these kids with a lot of attitude. Something changed in me then. It was just an opportunity to go away and join the circus, and that's what I did. So I was always hustling in bands. And I don't know why, but I cleaned my bank account out and I went and bought a Gretsch White Falcon. The goal was to make a living making music. That was all I wanted to do. To me, guitar playing was just something I needed to do physically. It was like a craft to me. It's like a job, it's like a trade to me. You know, I honestly just embodied where I'm from and what I am. The birthplace of the cult was in this place called Ian Asbury, the singer in what became the cult. He came to find me in London and he said, what are you up to, Billy? I just wanted to know if you wanted to do a band. I took about a second and a half and I said, yep, I'm in. And that was kind of how it all sort of came together, really. Ian just went, let's do some stuff. So we sat together and I just started cobbling together stuff, and I really wasn't very confident. I'd always been like a side guy in somebody else's creative thing. I would bring his cool guitar, cool haircut, whatever charm I could muster. I would always get a gig, but it was never my thing. It was always me adapting to work with somebody else, and they could see some value in having me. With Ian, it was a 50-50 equal partnership from day one, and still is 30-odd years later, where we just said, we were kind of like, we're in this together. We want to do something. We want to make music together for long term. Be committed to making a life out of being a musician. And then we kind of just tried to navigate a path with that in mind. But you take, you know, tribal drumming, bass lines that are a bit more riffy and a bit less like traditional bass, more like a riff-orientated bass. And I would just start making as much racket as I possibly could with pick guitars, crashing drums, you know. There's that little rock and roll theme that's gone all along since I was a kid. I was born in the centre of Manchester, and it was your typical, primarily Irish-descended, working-class, you know, neighbourhood. My dad was like just a typical construction, working-class, kind of drank, worked hard. That was about, you know, he did his very simple, kind of basic, blue-collar guy. And my mom was kind of a stay-at-home mother who used to work, and she was very enamoured with Hollywood. So there was always music around the house. Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, show tunes. Like she would like be able to recite like every single actor in every single Hollywood movie ever. So it's kind of ironic I ended up living in Los Angeles at the end of it all. So and my old man apparently, I never saw this thankfully, but when he used to get drunk, he would sing in the pub. And my brother, I've got a half brother on my mum's side, and he left his records, so there was like some 78s and lots of 7-inch singles that he'd had because he was kind of around. And so eventually I got one of those little old music players, the little, I think it was a dance set, you know, the thing that opens up. and you just put the records on and they drop down and play, and that was it. So there was always music in the house. My mum always had music going on, but her thing was primarily music from films, and I kind of discovered it that way. There was a store very close to my house, and they had, it wasn't a record store, it was like a grocery store, and they had like a rack of, it's not, almost like a newsagent's, and they would just have vinyl, but they were all like live albums. I think there was some weird kind of knockoff. They weren't legitimate releases, they were like dodgy live albums and this and that was cheaply sold. So there was a Jimi Hendrix one, I remember that. And I remember hearing him do a version of Johnny Be Good that was pretty special. That was a moment when I really thought about guitar, because it was the rock and roll thing that I understood. Like, it's kind of easy to digest as a young kid, but played by somebody with like real talent. Like, it was a whole other level. So that, I would say, is when I first really thought of like the guitar as something special, with Hendrix doing a live version of Johnny Be Good. My brother had a plastic, red and cream plastic Beatles guitar in the house that wasn't even really a guitar, it was like ukulele sized. I remember that was around, and I probably destroyed it. It's probably worth a lot of money now. And that was the first thing that looked like a guitar I ever got my hands on. But what actually happened was, when I went to my high school, I happened to get sat next to a kid who, his name was Robin. I meet this kid, we're talking, and we've both got music magazines, you know, because in the UK in the 70s, that was the Bible, because we really didn't have a lot of radio. Radio was minimal. There was like 2 channels of TV. It sounds like the Dark Ages, and it was kind of like the Dark Ages, but mildly less disease-ridden. So you got your information by like these weekly music magazines that were the tastemakers. And he was then a music obsessive too. So to cut a long story short, we became friends. He said, hey, I'm trying to put a band together. The kid in my street plays bass. We need a guitar player. Are you interested? And I kind of I'd never thought of it. And I went to my parents. And I think my mum talked my dad into buying me a guitar. And my first guitar was a black Les Paul custom copy. Horrible thing with a bolt-on neck. It was a travesty. And that was the first guitar, and I remember getting it, going to rehearsals. I had to buy a little practice amp, and I got a tuning fork, because there were no electronic tuners. They were just coming out. So you had to tune your guitar and learn how to tune by ear, and a tuning fork. It was crazy. And I went down, and off we went to rehearsals in my buddy Rob, his parents' hallway, and I remember the thing was like, right, I've got everything, now what? And they were looking at me, and I was looking, I couldn't play anything. I had no idea. So we ended up just, I remember getting a bottleneck, a slide, and I thought that would be easy because it's just one thing. I had no idea that you're supposed to tune it appropriately so it sounds cool. So I'm making this god-awful racket. And that was the first time I ever played a guitar in anger, was in my buddy's hallway of his house with his parents sitting in the next room, and we bashed through some stuff, and I was kind of learning, and I just kind of did the seat of my pants stuff. So that's how, kind of how it all started with me, was like that. It was always just like a hobby. I mean, I had certainly no idea of like getting a job. I mean, it was, you know, 13, 14 years of age. But it was like a little gang thing. We'd all get together. And then learning, we're trying to do covers. So it was Jumpin' Jack Flash, Hey Joe, we'd murder anything, you know. And then Rob, he was really getting into folk. Like, he was really into Crosby, Stills and Nash. And so we had this weird dynamic. Like, one guy in the band was into Hendrix. I was more into like, kind of pretty much like blue collar stuff. I kind of like the band Status Quo. I like Queen, Thin Lizzy, you know, we were just hacking away. I remember my first ever gig with this band, which I think was called 4-Way Street. hence the Crosby, Stills and Nash reference. We did Woodstock, the song Woodstock, and I think we murdered Snakeskin Cowboys off Ted Nugent's first solo album. It was really just high school eclectic, Born to be Wild, Jumping Jack Flash, played in the wrong key, you know, usual. And what really kind of changed everything a little bit was that the Sex Pistols played in Manchester. They played in a venue called the Lesser Free Trade Hall, which was a small mini theatre above a venue. So it held about 300 people, maybe, and it was pretty full, and it was a little theatre room, and there was the Buzzcocks open. The middle band was the main reason why I went, because they were a local neighbourhood band called Slaughter and the Dogs, and they were from Wythenshawe. And the Sex Pistols, which I read about in one of these music magazines, I remember seeing a picture of the band, the Pistols, and Johnny Rotten with chewing gum, sticking it on a window of a store that had a Beatles record in the window. And I remember that image and thinking, what is this? And so I was curious. So a few of the guys around this little band that we had, and a few other guys who weren't in the band but were buddies, who, when we were going to gigs together, went to this Pistols gig and watched the whole thing, and there was a lot of violence and a big brawl, and two guys left, and I stayed with the other guys, and we watched the Sex Pistols, and it, you know, it was kind of transformational. And that was the immediate, pretty much, death of the high school band, because it then split down the middle. Like, I was like, I think I like this thing that is punk, whatever that is, and the energy of it. And they were all, no, man, you know, we need to go more of a folky direction. That'll never catch on. That's not real music. So that was kind of a divide, and that happened a lot in the UK, you know. What happened was really seeing the Sex Pistols and Steve Jones with that cream Les Paul, and playing, you know, great, powerful stuff, but stuff that wasn't kind of, it was very effective, but it was minimalist. It made things more tangible for me. You know, that was it. It was like, it went from like the idea of being in a band was just a joke, and you played as a hobby, and, you know, rock stars were this otherworldly creatures who flew around in private jets, and that's kind of what they were doing at the time, the successful ones. And we were just these blue-collar, working-class kids with a lot of attitude who, you know, punk kind of spoke to us a little bit, and that gave us a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, you know. I mean, I was 15 years of age, just turned 15, so I didn't immediately run out and, you know, cut my hair. I mean, I wore a jacket that probably had names like, I remember drawing the Aerosmith logo on the back and the image from the Blue Oyster Cult, the cross with the thing on the bottom. And I remember it was like a denim bomber jacket, and I wore that to the Sex Pistols gig. I'll never forget that. Probably, I'm sure I had flares on and the whole like thing. It was pretty grisly, but I basically, something changed in me then. And up until that point, you know, I was digging like free albums and Queen and The Who, Montrose. I loved a lot of stuff, rock, Thin Lizzy, whatever. And then the Pistols kind of, that sort of changed everything for me. It reshifted my focus, and I got more into being into like the Stooges, the Dolls, all the influences of the punk bands, and the more of the underground. And I started hanging out, meeting people, because punk gigs started happening. But it all just came together, and the Les Paul, and then the energy of punk. And punk really was more of a lifestyle. Like, I left high school, I started getting very interested in girls, you know, and it just opened up, you know, my small world of my neighbourhood became the whole of Manchester, and I started hanging out in the centre of Manchester and going into town as much as possible to go to record stores, to search out new music. And that had been going on. Every Saturday morning was a ritual of going into town, going into the record stores, like trying to buy albums and discover new music. The thing with vinyl is it's ritualistic. There's something more magical and tangible about holding that, and you feel there's something to engage in, and there's something about it going round. Well, and I think with guitar players as well, we're all a bit ritualistic, and we'll only use certain guitars and certain types of strings or effects pedals, and it's just not the same anymore. Your imagination can get disengaged because now it's great. Go on YouTube. You know, there's things appearing on YouTube all the time from bands. It's amazing. But sometimes it's maybe too revealing, you know what I mean? A little bit of mysticism and magic and a bit of a struggle to actually discover music is important, I think, for all people, you know. Well, back in the 70s, you'd go to a record store and they'd kind of curate the good music for you, so something about this album drew me to it. It might have been the sleeve. I think a lot of the imagery was important. And I bought this record and kind of liked it, particularly the song Dancing Days, still one of my favorite Zeppelin songs. And I remember talking to the guy and he was like, well, if you like that, you should work backwards. So then, you know, I'd heard this because everybody played that at every party. You heard the typical Led Zepp stuff, and I was always trying to be a little precocious. And I got into, I could just about do physical graffiti, but after that, they kind of lost me in through the outdoor and all that. I was like, I can't, it's a bit too arty-farty. The Dolls were a big deal for me in Manchester. Like a little community of us got together because we were into this. We were into punk, but we were into this kind of New York, like the origins of punk were clearly in New York. You know, it was a British thing, really, but it was taken from a lot of elements. And this was it, the kind of irreverence. I mean, if you look at the guitars they're using, I wasn't so much into the glam thing, you know, like the high heels and the makeup. I was just into how cool they were. You know, it was just so unlike anybody. You know, there weren't people in Manchester that looked like Johnny Thunders, I can assure you of that. And the music was raw, and it was about stuff that was just different than our street life. And the New York Dolls, you know, they didn't make a lot of sense, but it was just a really good feeling. It doesn't have to all be poetry and be like, you know, make a lot of sense. Rock and roll doesn't have to make sense. I left high school in '77 and got involved working as a lookout for the guys who did illegal fly postering. They were a neighborhood little gang, and it's illegal, but the record companies used to send posters. There was a mail train, and they would send them up from London. It was all illegal, but nobody really did anything about it. And we would go and illegally fly poster within very specific geographic boundaries, because you didn't want to tread on another gang's turf. And I basically was the lookout for the cops. That's how kind of it all happened for me. Just got more actively involved in going out and experiencing things more hands-on, being in punk clubs and seeing all the punk bands and whatnot, AC/DC. We used to think AC/DC were a punk band initially because nobody really knew what punk was. You know, the rules hadn't been drawn up at that point. In '78, in Manchester, I ended up through this obsession with, you know, punk rock and the influences of punk rock, such as the New York Dolls and stuff. I started hanging out with Stephen Morrissey, go to a lot of gigs together, and as luck would have it, part of this fly tipping, this fly postering team, part of the guys involved in it were involved in a local punk band called Ed Banger and the Nosebleeds. That band split up, the bass player and drummer were left, and they asked me to audition because they knew I could play, and I guess I looked okay. I was very young, and I learnt this song, and it was quite complex because the guitar player was quite good in the Nosebleeds. I learnt this song, got the gig, and they said, do you know any singers? And I said, well, I know this guy Stephen who I've been hanging out with, but you know, he's kind of weird. He's unusual. There's nothing like him. People were still punk, you know, spitting, and it was quite an aggressive time. And Morrissey was really not like that. he was quite, he was what he became, you know, he was kind of different. He had longer curly hair and all that, but basically, he was a bit of an oddball character, very intelligent, and I get him in the band. We call the band the Nosebleeds. We do 2 gigs. I think we fulfilled an outstanding commitment from Ed Banger and the Nosebleeds. So we kept the name the Nosebleeds, but we wrote all new songs and didn't play any of their old songs. So that was a transformation from being in a hobby band to playing to like your friends. So suddenly these were real gigs, legitimate. That's why punk, you know, was the catalyst for that. So by 78, I'd done a couple of quote-unquote real gigs. I got asked to join a band with one of Slaughter and the Dogs, and I kind of left Morrissey behind and I left Manchester behind, and it was really more a question of getting an opportunity to go and live in London. Manchester was kind of violent, and I'd been going out a lot there, and it was just a little... I just wasn't enjoying my home life, so it was just an opportunity to kind of like go away and join the circus, and that's what I did. I moved to London in January '79 with this new band, with Mick Rossi. It ended up being called Studio Sweethearts, and we did put a single out, and I thought I'd hit the big time. Well, that band splits up, and they reformed Slaughter and the Dogs, so they kicked me out, because they're like, well, we're sorry, but we're reforming the old band because this band isn't working, and we need your room. So I remember that was a bit upsetting. And then I got a job. I started hanging out on the King's Road, because the King's Road in London was where all the punks used to go, and it was like a centre for punk rock. I started hanging out there, and I ended up getting a Saturday job at this store called Johnson's. So that enabled me to get even more integrated, because rock bands would come in there. And I knew Boy George. He used to work in one of the clothes shops. And at one night out in a club, George pointed out this singer who kind of had white, spiky, kind of a rock and roll, kind of quiff hairdo. And I was doing the rockabilly spiky thing, kind of punk rock rockabilly look. And they said, you should go and talk to that guy. You're a guitar player, and he's got a good band. They're looking for a guitar player. And I'd heard them on the radio. This band was called Theatre of Hate. So I just introduced myself, and I said, oh, I've heard that you're looking for a guitar player. The singer was like, well, what guitar would you get if you got in the band? And I said, well, I think I'd get one of those Gretsch White Falcons. I don't know why the guitar was so symbolic. It was like this massive statement guitar. And I was drawn to it in a sort of grey and dreary London. And I just spent everything I'd saved up from my very good job at Johnson's, and I went and bought a Gretsch White Falcon. One of the things to explain about like that era of what I would describe as post-punk, it was like bands like Theatre of Hate, maybe Killing Joke, Bauhaus. There was a bunch of bands coming up. I mean, even Echo and the Bunnymen, Teardrop Explodes, and. There was a lot of bands. But all fans of punk who were trying to do our own thing. And in order to do your own thing, people were reaching for different kind of instruments and always looking to try and get a different sound. That's why the Gretsch was a tool. It was coincidentally, I think there was like a rockabilly thing happened in London where the Stray Cats showed up and were so amazing that everybody was like, wow, what's this? And they were having hit records. And it just, the two things kind of came together, like reaching for a different sound. And Theatre of Hate was kind of cinematic. You know, the Gretsch enabled you to get a kind of a twang and a certain body to it that was kind of unique, you know. But getting the Gretsch changed everything because it had a lot of limitations. Obviously, going from a solid body to a semi-acoustic, and a big semi-acoustic at that, there was an incredible amount of issues with feedback. Guitars would howl. You know, you learned how to stuff them with material of some description to deaden them somewhat so that they weren't creating this god-awful din and you couldn't play it as fast as a regular guitar. You couldn't just like it was hard. You had to work at it. It's kind of like an effort to get something out of a Gretsch, and to a degree, it still is. You know, it's definitely, as Mr. Asprey would call it, a man's guitar. If you really want to tame it, you know, it's a thing that you have to really man up to, you know. I definitely learnt a lot from being in Theatre of Hate. You know, it was a great instructional, taking me from kind of more of a traditional, like I said, like Steve Jones, Johnny Thunders, New York Dolls-y, rock and roll punk, you know, 101 type, you know, music. Theatre of Hate, everything had shifted. The emphasis of all the instruments had kind of moved around. So the guitar had become more skeletal. And it didn't just have to be chunky block chords all the time. You know, guitars could have like melodic hooks. You could let echo work for you. I just had a different sense. So it's just a question of pulling all that together. But it wasn't my music. I contributed a little bit towards the end to the new songs they were writing for the follow-up album. As we were on tour, we started writing, but they, you know, they had a self-contained great singer-songwriter in Kurt Brandon. So really, I didn't really get in terms of trying to get my own songs together till I met Ian. And in the course of being in Theatre of Hate and touring, we got a support band on a British tour that was the Southern Death Cult. That's how I met Ian. Met him in a gig in near Stoke. And they were the support band for a tour, and we became friends and kept in contact. And eventually, within a short time, I was no longer in Theatre of Hate. I kind of got the boot. And Ian is still in Southern Death Cult, but I noticed that he was becoming increasingly dissatisfied. And they were the up-and-coming hot new band. You know, everybody was saying they were going to be the new thing. But Ian left them. I mean, in essence, that's what happened. So I had a Gretsch. I lived in London. I didn't have a band. I went back to working, doing what I knew, which was selling clothes. I didn't have anywhere to live because I'd lost my apartment. And then out of the blue, I find out that Ian had left Southern Death Cult and wanted to find me because he liked the way I played guitar. And we became the Cult in January of 1984. Once we got together, from the day one, we were busy. We were booking gigs. We never really just sat around. We were very active. You know, I remember writing. We better write some songs quick so we can get out on the road. You know, we made our first album, Dreamtime, primarily because we couldn't get gigs in Europe because the promoters wanted an album. We'd only done EPs or singles. But we lacked a hit. And there was this wait, and we'd put records out, and they were like, good, but not good enough. And there was this, you know, we had a few moments of doubt, of like, are we ever going to like make the next step? But we got Steve Brown, who's this like maverick pop producer who'd done more like, I think he did Wham's first album. Crazy, like eccentric guy, but a great ear for pop. And we said, all right, well, we'll try one single then. And that song happened to be She Sells Sanctuary. So we went in and we insisted on recording it where Led Zeppelin recorded, because we'd already started getting ideas about rock and the history of rock and how people were kind of missing some of the goodness at the roots and the core of rock and the blues element and the soul to it, because it'd all been about punk and haircuts and negativity and attitude. And I think that was the moment where, because we specifically went and spent a lot of money recording at quite a dilapidated old studio called Olympic. It's where Free and Zeppelin recorded their early records. So we were in a studio that we were hoping to have the ghosts of Zeppelin and Free and all the cool music there. And there was a violin bow laying on the floor. It was an orchestral studio. They used to show movies and the orchestra would record in there. It was very old-fashioned, very much the antithesis of everybody reaching for new technology. This was an old valve, stinky old studio. And I just tried to reenact the Song Remains the Same thing with the violin bow. You know, when Jimmy Page hit the guitar with a violin bow, and I just put all my effects on. I was just doing it for a laugh with Ian. And I turned every foot pedal that I had on for my little live rig, or my little Boss pedals, just to enhance the effect, to make it sound even more stupid. And I don't know who said it, probably Steve Brown, the producer, said, why don't you play that middle section with that sound once the violin bow joke was over? And that's how the intro started, which became kind of a big part of it, because you got like what's now subsequently become the drop on dance records. You have that intro, it builds up the thing, and then the release is the snare hit, and suddenly it's on. You know, it's a classic device in music. We stumbled on it through a bunch of things, but it was all good, honest, naive guys reaching back for the source as best we could do it with our limited means. So, really, it's a little bit of a cleaner sound. There's a couple of delays, there's like a short delay and a more medium delay together. So it creates that, like one is not the same, so you got the two. And that primarily came from the riff, which was a... It's that action and the way those two pedals interact with each other. So the sound we've pretty much established is a couple of amps. It doesn't have to be 3 amps, but the Roland with the chorus is important. I don't use chorus pedals. I've always just used chorus off this particular amp because it has a certain way of spreading the sound. Somehow, magically, this 120 just has an ability to project what I want sonically, and live, we mic it stereo, the chorus is stereo, so we just put 2 mics on it and we pan it to either side of the PA. So in effect, you just get a gargantuan version of that amp spread, and then we kind of bring the valve amps in around it to give it like lots of meat. The AC30 combo is an open back combo, gives it a lot of chime, Malcolm Young, if you will, Pete Townsend. And then for the lead and the heavier stuff and the real bottom end chunk, I use a Marshall, or these days I've been using a Friedman. And then basically, during the verse, you just drop and add an overdrive and you go. Sanctuary became a hit. It got on the charts. It hung around the charts a long time, and it helped us establish us as a band from the underground in the indie world to being considered a more mainstream act. So everybody around us, the manager and the record company, said, oh, well, just off you go and make an album. Just more of that, please. And we used the same producer, and the album became the Love album, and we had a couple more hits, and the band established itself. And the admission I've got to make is that when we did the album, I never got one decent sound out of one amp. I always used a multi-amp because the Gretsch was still a bit underpowered, so it was never driving the amps hard enough. And there's only so much overdrive and stuff you can hit early without it sounding really crap. So play around with different amps. I remember on the Love album, we literally had 5 different amp setups all mic'd up, and we just blend them depending on the song to try and get the best sound. And the only other thing that was really relevant about the album was at the end of the writing session for that album, we came up with 2 songs. One was called The Phoenix and one was called Love. And they were much heavier. And that's where I started using the wah-wah. but still all on the Gretsch. And I think with those two songs, that changed the essence of the Love album. And the Phoenix was a pivotal moment in the Cult where that kind of old acid, psychedelic, gothic thing came together, where there's literally 5 guitars going on at once on the Phoenix on the record. Because the producer was mental. He was like, I don't know how to mix this, so we just, everything, it was all in. And Ian just was, Ian loved it. He was like what he was looking for. So I think that was, Sanctuary was the gateway, and I think the song The Phoenix, which we still play a lot, was like, oh, that could be the way forwards. I liked to sound check just to warm myself up. I never used to when I was a kid. I used to just drink, and then I thought I was ready. I remember me and Ian used to chug a bottle of cheap German white wine before we'd play. That was the fuel in which the early Cult used to get gig ready. I forgive myself. But then I noticed on a certain tours, we played with a couple of bands who had really good guitar players, and I noticed no matter how much they drank or partied, they always warmed up to. And I started taking it a bit more seriously and realised that there was a bit more to it than just having a cool haircut and, you know, a nice guitar. You actually had to do a bit of work. Baby, with you. I learned that from hanging out with guys like Aerosmith and Black Sabbath and stuff, learning off those guys who've been doing it a long time. So we've done well. I've got this sound, the band's got an identity, we've broken through. We go on tour, we do the Love album, we start writing new songs, and we started making steps towards more of a rock sound. So the album that was the follow-up to Love never really got a title, but it was supposed to be Peace, maybe, I don't know. That was the working title of it. And it was what became Electric. The songs were there, but we tried the same production and layering techniques that had worked on Love, and they didn't work on Electric. And the producer was pulling his hair out because he'd had a great hit album with the Cult doing Love, so he came back to do the next album, and it just wasn't working. So, like any proper stupid band, we, instead of stopping, we man it out to the end. We record the album at an expensive residential studio with an extensive wine cellar and a chef. We go to the most expensive mixing studio in London. We mix it and realize it isn't any good. So, been exposed to Rick Rubin by listening to a song he did with the Beastie Boys, which was beats, but AC/DC riffs. And it was like fresh and new. And we were excited by it. So we got hold of Rick. It's a true story. We went to New York, met Rick, and he just said, why are you doing all this kind of, and I quote him, this pussy English stuff. Just, you know, let's get to the essence of it. And we told the record company and our managers we were going to recut one song. Bearing in mind we'd spent hundreds of thousands of pounds making an album. Nobody was going to say throw that away and make a new record. They said, well, recut one song because that's Rick's rule. He'll do the album if you let him cut one song from the ground up, and that was going to be Love Removal Machine, and he would remix the album. In retrospect, that was never ever going to happen because the way we'd done that album and the way Rick Rubin works, completely different. So we get to New York. It's an amazing, dangerous, exciting place. And, you know, LL Cool J's there, the Beastie Boys. It's like all going on. Slayer around, Anthrax. There's like a whole different thing going on. And we're like, whoa, what's this stuff happening? And we basically had a conversation with something like this. Rick went, you like early Zeppelin, right? We went, yeah, early. And he went, you like early Aerosmith, right? We went, yeah. He said, do you like AC/DC? We went, yeah. He said, so let's make a record. So that was about as complicated as it was. And he just said, all that stuff, that Gretsch and all that echoey, and get rid of all that. That's a Marshall, that's a Les Paul, off you go. Rick kind of minimised everything. It was like a bit of overdrive on a Marshall and basically a Les Paul using Ernie Ball strings. And all of the riffs on that album were kind of basically simplified. I think the whole concept of electric was reduction and allowing space. So you need a guitar that was tighter, you know. It's kind of the antithesis of a Gretsch. I had a lot of fun doing it, bringing it all together on a Les Paul, not on a Gretsch. I could play it on a Gretsch, but it'd be harder, and you'd get a lot more feedback issues. You know, Gretsch, I tried to tell, it's a bit like driving a, you know, like a Cadillac or an SUV. You wouldn't take it on a racetrack, you know what I mean? I've done guitar playing for like well over a decade, all the time, so I just got a little bit burnt on it, I guess. And I wasn't liking the stuff I was writing. It was getting a bit too much based around showing off. When the cult broke up, I went back to the UK and kind of got a bit of an outdoorsy kind of thing going on for a few years, riding motorbikes, going out in the mountains. Successful enough, you don't have as much time to do extracurricular activities, so that's what I pursued when an enforced layoff was put in my lap, you know. It was a weird period. We got the band back together after about a 5-year break. I don't know, it was a tough one because we got back together, we did a tour. Everything was great. We got a record deal, one of the last big record deals before the whole music business went south. And we just couldn't write any songs. Just couldn't, like, me and Ian, the magic wasn't there, you know what I mean? So it was kind of like a struggle. Getting that chemistry and getting that working relationship back together required a little bit of endeavour. When you talk about, like, you know, a 50-50 songwriting partnership, if I'm not writing music that he wants to sing over, nothing really much is going to happen, except you're not going to be a band anymore. So it was important to kind of be on the same page, emotionally maybe, or spiritually. Then suddenly the songs started coming and the album took shape. It was like it just kind of amped up dark record. Got a few different things, like the whole album I did on a drop D tuning. Drop D, no big deal, you just tune the bottom string down to D. Just adds a much more ominous overtone and takes the guitar into a low register. And many other bands go way lower than D, they go way down the the scale down into, sounds that only dogs can hear. I like, from time to time, go to guitar stores. Norm's is like the LA version of where I used to hang out in London. It's got everything. And the stuff on display is only the half of it. What Norm's got in the back is what's really valuable. So this is kind of an example of a 70s Gretsch, which wasn't really considered particularly desirable, but I love all the guitars. The only thing I hate about the guitars of this era are the pickups, because they're underpowered. And my first Falcon was a lot like this, except it had the full, this has the different markers on the neck. But basically, it's got the tremolo arm's a big deal for me. I like this kind of arm, which is rarer than the regular sort of Bigsby. So this guitar's pretty cool. I like this. This could be easily something that I would get a hold of in England in the 70s when I was a kid, or early 80s. It's a 70s guitar. So that was the Sharkins, but better if it was a White Falcon, which is basically the same guitar that looks a lot better, because that just looks a bit like Danish furniture, with a wood grain. So, and when I got my first Gretsch, the only one I could find out was a double cutaway. It wasn't what I wanted. I wanted a single cutaway. This, just because of the way it looked, totally vanity, really. And that's a big part of being a guitarist. It, to me, was the look. When I was in England, when I was a kid, I could afford one of these. This is a very cheap Gibson Melody Maker. You could see the pickup there on it. Little puny, thin thing, and it sounds worse than it looks. What I wanted was one of these. It's what Johnny Thunders played. It's a lot thicker. P90 pickup, much more ballsy. Still single coil, so a bit noisy, but this is what I wanted. Couldn't afford it. So poor old me ended up with one of these. And every time I see one of these guitars, I'm reminded of having a compromise, because I was so broke that I wanted that, could only get that. That isn't as good as that. But in the end, I had Gibson make me one of these, my own particular one with my own specifications, which was at the custom shop for doing a gig for them. They said, we'll make you anything you want. And like an idiot, I got them to make a very cheap guitar. I should have got the most expensive guitar they made, but I ain't bright. Never claimed to be clever. I always like Les Paul Customs, and I don't even know why I like them better. I just do. I'm just drawn to them more. The 70s, the cream Les Paul Customs were like what everybody wanted to be, get hold of. That was the preeminent guitar. And then I got into the wood-fronted variety as a bit of a Mick Ronson tribute, but this one has a maple neck. It's kind of unusual. I mean, I personally couldn't play that, but this wood front is just a natural finish, and I kind of got into doing that for a while. I mean, the end of the day, part of me just says the same thing that Steve Jones and the Pistols once said. He said, look, they're just a bit of wood with strings on them. At the end of the day, it can be as simple as that. It's really about the person playing it. So there was like this lineage of guitar players with Les Pauls with a bit of an attitude, but, good melodic content. And I like the guitar to kind of move you and feel really powerful. I was in it a big much. The like Mick Ronson, the solo to Moonage Daydream with Bowie, it was very emotional. It had a emotive thing. I never liked guitar players that were heady. I've never mentioned any guys that were like, all playing from the head and scales and, stuff. I mean, I just never interested me. In Britain, we have, there is sort of a class society, and I think that a lot of the more cerebral players were more middle class, or public school boys, you know, and they made more arty-farty music, and they, you know, whatever, and that's great, and I've enjoyed some of it, but it wasn't who I was. You know, I was a working class kid from a housing estate in the south of Manchester, and it was a bit of a tough, rough and tumble existence. So, you know, I honestly just embodied where I'm from and what I am, you know. I had a very, very kind of prosaic, pragmatic view of guitar playing. It was like a craft to me. It's like a job. It's like a tradesman. You know, I'm not a poet. You know, I'm not a. You know, I just write music that hopefully connects with people. You know, I feel something. I work it out on the guitar, and I've luckily had since meeting Ian, I've had a stable framework in which to explore that and get it out, and that vital partner, that voice, to put words to you know, the kind of, it's almost like a painting, you know. I kind of paint, he puts the detail on the canvas, I kind of do a painting, and the music suggests to him, you know, certain songs you couldn't possibly write certain lyrics about, you know, it suggests this feel. So that's how we work, you know. He kind of feels the music that I write and writes lyrics that are more in that, you know, suitability range, you know. The challenge is really just coming up with the new music, because without any new music, the cult becomes basically a nostalgia act. And I've never really been comfortable with that. Ian's certainly not comfortable with it. You know, we don't mind playing the old songs, but you know, for us, it has to be in harmony with trying to be creative and moving forwards and constantly reaching. One of the reasons why the cult's still going and people still bother to come and see us is that I think, you know, we try and put on a bit of a show. And it is a real, honest, live, organic rock band. You know, and we got to play it and feel it and mean it. Really, to me, that was always what I felt it was all about. Making records was just something you did in between. So live, like when somebody said to me, like being in a band, doing gigs and touring was what the whole thing was about. It wasn't like, I want to write songs and express myself and then, oh dear, I've got to go on tour. You know, I always just wanted to, I always saw myself as a touring musician, you know, kind of traveling guy. So you have to be careful what you wish for, because, you know, that's what I got. We were kind of an arena act for a while, and it was fun, but I always felt that was a bit beyond where I felt comfortable. It's ultimately not as satisfying as a 4,000 or 5,000 people and crammed into a kind of big theatre or something. It has a bit more soul to it, you know. I think musically, the cult uplifts people. We elate them a bit. I like that. I don't want to be remembered as anything serious. And the thing I'm proudest of, being, to my mind, one of the first, maybe still one of the only guys to really get some, like, seriously acid, rocky, mental sounds out of a Gretsch. Like, that was my little thing where I was like, why can't you make this guitar go like bonkers with a wah-wah and like really make a different sound? I think finding your own sound's more important than anything. I mean, any idiot can sit at home and learn how to play all the greatest rock songs ever. But it's funny, lately, as I've gotten older, it's like people saying, like, you know, you've been pretty underrated. And a lot of great guitar players have been underrated. You know, at least I'm still alive. You know, a lot of them had to die before people recognized, you know, how good they were or their contributions. So to me, guitar playing was just something I needed to do physically. it's like a physical need that I have to play, and when I don't, after a while, I'm not that great, physically. So that's all really. I don't have a, particular desire. Here lies Billy Duffy, the old tombstone. Probably just picture, there'll be a picture of a Gretsch, White Falcon.